My name's Tim. I'm a musician, a car collector, an automotive journalist, and a lover of all things automotive. I've bought and sold collectible cars for 2 decades, and I hope my experiences and my point of view helps you find the car of your dreams. Here it is at last, the car of my dreams, the Lotus Esprit S4s, a 1995 model year car finished in Lotus Racing Green with OZ Futuras. Does it get any better than this? Lotus learned a lot in Formula One racing. I think they're a lot like Ferrari in that way. And they took what they learned on the racetrack and applied it to the Lotus Esprit. The road car was absolutely one of the best of the era. That Lotus Sport badge says all you need to know about what's going on in this engine bay. The S4 designation means that this is the 4th iteration of the Lotus Esprit. By this time, they had honed and perfected that fantastic recipe that is the Lotus Esprit. The interior is larger and better appointed than early cars, and overall, it's just a fantastic place to be. In the United States, most of our S4 cars are 1994 model year designations. Most of the S4s's are 1995 model year designations. Early in 93, there's a split year model, a 93.5, where it's between an SE and an S4, and I talked about that a little bit in the V8 Esprit video as well. Nearly everything about the S4 and S4s vehicles is pretty much as good as it gets, with the exception of this ABS. The ABS on this car is pretty dreadful.
In the States, the S4s is a little bit different than the S4s that they got in Europe. I think I like it the way it is, but we do not get the fender flare addenda. On the V8s, there's a fender flare that sort of covers this area right here. Does it look better with the fender flare? I mean, I think it does add a little bit more aggression, but you still get the really aggressive front air dam, you still get the side skirts, you still get the molded rear bumper that I think adds enough of the aggression, including this super long rear wing. And again, to highlight, the rear deck actually clears the wing. So the wing on the V8 cars, the later V8 cars, so like 98 and on, it's actually mounted to the deck lid. Sits up a little bit higher. The earlier S4 has a mid-wing that you may remember from our mid-wing sort of restoration project that mounts about here. The S4s in the first year in the States, which would have been the 97 V8, have this long tail, and this actually sticks out past the back bumper, which I think adds something to the silhouette of the car. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I think the Lotus Esprit is significantly better than Ferraris or Porsches of the era in a lot of different ways. One thing that I can say is that the 4-cylinder really suits the car. I think this iteration of the 4-cylinder with the larger turbo, larger charge cooler, everything's just right, blows tasty flames, and I think it stays with Colin Chapman's credo of add lightness.
Clearly is a sweet car, and the 4-cylinder is a little more peaky than the V8. When it comes on boost, I'm at about 3,000 RPMs, and when it comes on boost, that was all the way to 70-something hundred RPMs, just over 7,000 RPMs, and it really puts you in your seat. So with the lower boost V8 engine and the V8 sort of making all the torque, that's really the beauty of the V8 is it has torque. So down low, yeah, it is a sweeter car probably to drive if you're not used to revving a car out, or if you're used to V8 cars in general. It clearly has more torque than the 4-cylinder. The 4-cylinder, right now I'm off boost in 5th gear, 1800. I put my foot down, it's dead. There's nothing there. So I mean, I think there's something to be said for that sort of tractability of the V8 car, but I don't really miss it. From the factory, these do not come with very inspiring exhaust notes. I will say that's a weird thing for me. Even Ferraris from this era, Porsches from this era, the factory exhaust is not exotic enough. And so this car is fitted with a Southwest Lotus Center exhaust, and boy does it wake up the car. And I will say, this car, I wouldn't say it felt sluggish before, but man, it really woke up the car to add that exhaust. And so all of these cars I've always done an exhaust, 4-cylinder and V8. It is a stock car. It's not completely stock. I'll say this, the Lotus Esprit was designed to use a 4-cylinder engine. As much as I love the V8, and some of you are gonna hate to hear me say that, the S4s is probably the ultimate Lotus Esprit that isn't super limited production. Sport 300s, super rare. Sport 350 V8, super rare. There's a few more of these. They're still, in the grand scheme of things, like hen's teeth. So it's not like they're just S4s's everywhere, but you're more likely to find an S4s, and I think it's the ultimate when it comes to Lotus Esprit, this era. Now, I'll review the S1 and the S3 because there's some other attributes there, but if you want pure steering, a nice ride, we just went over a ridiculous 2-inch drop, and there's just something about British cars, and particularly Lotus, that you can pitch this car into a corner and it's just sublime. The car is just sublime. And I think that's something you get from the 4-cylinder that you don't with the 8. And let me be a little more specific. The 8, it just feels like the weight is a little bit higher up. I don't know that there's that much more of it, because if you look at the spec sheet, it's not like radically heavier, but it feels like there's someone sitting on your shoulders. If you've ever had a kid do a piggyback ride, you know, like, you're super top heavy. Or if you've done a chicken fight in a pool, I mean, you're really fighting to keep this mass of additional weight a little bit higher. You feel it. And the polar moment, the rotational center of the car, just feels a little bit less perfect than it does in the S4s. And really, I'd say even the S4. Reality is, you can buy an S4, you can modify it, you can do a lot of things to sort of split the difference. But if you're looking for a car that's rare, low production, and will go up in value, luckily these S4 and S4s cars haven't yet gone crazy. And so I think you're more apt to find it, and the good news is, the secret is, they're the best. As we're rolling along here, we just clocked 54,000 miles on this car. And by Esprit standards, that's not a particularly high mileage car. And I think that says something about these vehicles. Another thing to think about is V8 versus 4-cylinder. You grenade a V8, you got 8 very, very valuable pistons to think about. In this car, 4 cylinders. So there's that. Driving this back-to-back with a 993 or a 348 or even a 355, one thing that the British cars do a lot differently than particularly the Germans, but also I'd say the Italians, is they weren't really going after a huge amount of structural rigidity with these cars. I've said this before, but it's noticeable driving one of these back-to-back with those cars, or then driving like an Evora or an Exige. Those cars are almost predicated on how stiff the chassis is, how stiff the tub is. This car really dances and moves across bumps. As a result, you do get some squeaks and rattles that you don't get in, you might get in like a Cabriolet 911. But at the limit, the way the car moves around is just such a nice thing. I will say there's not a lot of great information on the internet or on YouTube about Lotus Esprits. Really, the only other good video that comes to mind is Henry Catchpool's review of the Sport 300. And even that car, you can see that there's roll sort of programmed into it, but it's not roll like you'd get in a giant Bodie car. It's very predictable, very progressive, and really has never been a turnoff for me. Thinking back to reviews of the time, you know, one of the critiques would be it isn't as structurally rigid. But when you take the body off the frame on this car and you see that X-frame, it is a really intelligent design, and it's one that they really pioneered back with the Elite and the Elan in the 60s. And Colin Chapman was onto something. Even if you look at some of the F1 chassis, they aren't as structurally rigid as some of their counterparts, but man, do they get the job done. Worldwide, there are only 367 Lotus S4s. That is a rare car. This is my favorite spec of the car, and I think that if you drive them all back to back, SE, S4, S4s, V8, I think you'll come to a real similar conclusion. The S4s is a special car, and the 910S Lotus engine that's in it, I love the 910S. I think so many people in the era really, really wanted a V8. This car needs to be a V8 to be a true supercar. I just don't know. It makes all kinds of good noises. It looks great. It sounds great. I actually have the engine cover off right now so I can look at it, and it's a magical thing. I love the car. And I think that one thing to keep in mind is look up reviews of this car in the day. When the S4s came out, Road and Track, European Car Magazine, they all loved the car. And I think that speaks volumes about the Lotus Esprit S4s. My favorite Esprit. Is the S4s right for you? It has to be, right? Think about all the issues with older exotic cars. Rust, parts availability, expense. Literally none of those things are issues with Lotus Esprits. They have a galvanized frame. The body is composite, Kevlar, and fiberglass. One of the most state-of-the-art bodies at the time. The car has genuine Can-Am, Formula One, sports car racing, heritage, and pedigree. It's a true, very hand-built, limited production automobile. If I were you, I'd get one. In fact, I'd get several. I have. And I wouldn't tell you anything that I didn't believe myself. So if the opportunity presents itself, grab a Lotus Esprit. As I've said before, I'm confident you'll love it.